So welcome everyone. So good to see all of you here today, both those of you here in our sanctuary and of course, those of you at home on Zoom. I think it's fitting that for a man who spent his life in journalism and broadcasting, his memorial should be the first memorial service that we are doing in hybrid mode. And so many of you have asked if it's being recorded, and I think you got that answer just a few minutes ago. It will be available on our YouTube channel of the church. So if you would like to view it later or share it with someone else, you're very welcome. It is just a blessing to be here celebrating Robert Gordon Abernethy's life today, and to have so many family and friends and colleagues here with us, congregants, of course, congregation members were all Bob's friends. And I ask that we begin by joining together in prayer. Loving and eternal God, we are gathered here to celebrate the life of Robert Gordon Abernethy, husband of Mary and father of Jane and Elizabeth. It is always hard to say goodbye, but we are grateful for the long and wonderful life Bob lived, and know he lived it to the fullest. We ask you to be with those he has left behind, comforting them in their sorrow and embracing them with your love. And we pray for your presence here today as we remember him. Amen.
Amen.
Please rise as you are able for our opening hymn, number 67 in the red hymnal. Now I welcome Bob's friend and colleague, Janice Henderson, who will read a passage from the prophet Isaiah as we think of the gentle journalist, scholar, seeker that was Bob.
To Bob's family, thank you for asking me to participate, and thank you for sharing him with us. I'll be reading Isaiah 11th chapter, verses 1 through 9. A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and awe of the Lord. His delight shall be in awe of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide the equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall overcome the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loins. The wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hands on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea.
That section of Isaiah is known as the peaceable kingdom, and Jane and I both felt that it reminded us of Bob. I'm going to offer a short eulogy followed by some selected hymns played by our organist Harold Walbert, also a good friend of Bob's. And then we'll hear from several family members and friends with their remembrances. We know that all of you have memories and thoughts and stories about Bob as well, and we welcome you to share them with one another during the reception following the service. So I met Bob in 2011, right after I was called here as this church's pastor. When he was 81, I was, well, we won't go there. And 9 years later, he moved, or 8 years later, he moved from DC to New Hampshire when he was 89. So I had a lot less time with him than most of you, and I really, truly wish I'd had more. Robert Gordon Abernethy, with an E, was a rare combination of humility, confidence, pragmatism, and spiritual depth. The many times we met for conversation and counsel, he was always interested in bettering himself as a human being. Even when I encouraged him to have more self-compassion, aka cut himself some slack. Bob cared deeply about being a decent, even good human in this world. He knew he fell short of his own high bar, but he continued trying, and I know inspired those around him to do the same. Of course, I didn't know that Robert, but his cousin Dick Dutton, who is with us online today, says Bob was always a mentor to him. From bicycling together to learning to swim, to his adventures at Princeton, to summers at Deering Lake in New Hampshire, to conversations about a possible new TV program, Religion and Ethics News Weekly. Dick continues, when in the midst of this journey, Bob went to Yale for a religious studies adventure, we began a series of conversations about our spiritual journeys. It was a huge bonding experience for which I will be eternally grateful. And I know that Dick's words, so many of us could share as well. I remember Bob, as I know so most of you remember him with great fondness, respect, and appreciation for that last professional endeavor, Religion and Ethics News Weekly. It was a show I watched before being called to serve this church, and it was a great honor to pastor this man who was such a wonderful combination of scholar and seeker with a good bit of journalist thrown in. If you've never read his book, The Life of Meaning, shame on you. No, just kidding. If you've never read his book, Life of Meaning, I encourage you to do so. Not just because you knew and loved Bob, but because it is a truly excellent compilation of transcripts from interviews with everyone from the Dalai Lama to Thich Nhat Hanh to Desmond Tutu to William Sloane Coffin, Jimmy Carter, and Marilyn Robinson. Truthfully, the last was a special favorite of his, and he quoted her in a sermon he gave from this pulpit in 2009. She says, "I have spent my life watching, not to see beyond the world, merely to see great mystery, what is plain before my eyes." Robinson's book, Gilead, makes me think of Bob. And I wonder if the main character, John Ames, reminded him of his own grandfather, a Baptist minister. Bob and his mother moved in with his grandparents shortly after his father's death in 1930, when he was just a small child, even a toddler. And I imagine they were a great influence on his life. Even as I write this, now speak it, I feel sad I didn't have more time to talk with Bob, to ask more questions, to hear more stories, which makes me think that we should all always take advantage of each other. I'm ad-libbing a little bit here, but take advantage of each other while we're still here. Ask those questions, hear those stories, experience those memories. Every human life is an adventure. And Bob's was blessedly rich with interesting work, travel, and human relationship. Of course, it contained heartache as well. For not only did he lose his father as a small child, but he lost his wife in his early 50s. Yet as Bob discovered and believed, resurrection and new life, redemption and a new way forward can be real. Jean and Bob had a beautiful daughter, Jane, who was both baptized and married in this church. And after Jean's death, Bob found love with Mary and their beautiful baby daughter, Elizabeth, who was also dedicated in this church. Life goes on. Meaning emerges from confusion, and this happens again and again. And this fascinated Bob. Or as he quoted Frederick Buechner, listen to your life. Pay attention. Maybe nothing will come of that, but maybe the secrets of all secrets you need to hear may come through some event, something that happens or fails to happen. And so Bob kept asking questions. He interviewed, considered, conversed, and shared. And even after Religion and Ethics News Weekly went off the air and he'd moved back to New Hampshire, then to Maine because his health required more assistance, even then, he hoped to create a future broadcast documenting the lives of homeless people he had met at the gathering place in Brunswick. This was Bob, a person who really wanted to be part of what Judaism calls tikkun olam, or repair of the world. And I can't imagine a better role to play. In closing, I share these words from Jean's memorial service sent by Bob's cousin Dick, who says they're especially relevant in this moment as a reflection on Bob's life. Though I searched for an attribution, I could find none, so I share them with gratitude to an unknown author. As followers of God, we are called to search out the lost and lonely and to heal with tender love, to feed the hungry with warmth and good food, to feel the earth beneath us and to see the sky above, to free the prisoner from the chains of rejection and isolation, to help the strong and powerful to care, to do our share in rebuilding goodwill among all kind and manner of people, to bring hope to every task we do, to dance at new birth, to bring music to an old person's heart, to sing to the many colors of the earth. These are the mystery of what we are meant to do and be. And with God's help and light, we can and will. Amen. Thank you so much, Harold. And I'll take this opportunity to express great gratitude to our sound tech guys, both volunteers from our congregation, Don Marshall and Teddy Corrales, who just wanted to make sure that the folks online could hear the organ, and they could. So thank you guys again. Now several family members and friends are going to share their remembrances of Bob, beginning with Arnie Labaton.
Hi, I'm Arnie Labaton. Regrettably, they fixed the mic so you can hear me. But I first met Bob Abernethy in July 1999. Tammy Robinson, NET's programming head, recruited me to become Religion and Ethics News Weekly's executive producer. The program was finishing its second season and seeking funding from the Lilly Endowment for a third year. At the time, I had never met Bob or anyone else on the show's very talented staff. Bob had previously completed a long and distinguished career at NBC News. His assignments at NBC included being its London correspondent and Moscow bureau chief. He told me that in Russia, the winters were so cold that on the pieces he reported, he avoided doing his sign-off because he couldn't say his name. While still at NBC, reflecting his interest in his faith, as the pastor just mentioned, he took a sabbatical to attend Yale Divinity School. And after Bob retired, he spent 2 years trying to raise funds for the public television series that would become Religion and Ethics News Weekly, before he and Tammy Robinson convinced Craig Dykstra of the Lilly Endowment to provide funding for a first year. Except that Bob and I both had spent many years in television production, we had very different personal backgrounds. After the premature death of Bob's father, when Bob was a young boy, he was raised by his mother, grandmother, and grandfather, who was the pastor of a prominent DC Baptist church. Bob sustained his religious faith throughout his life. I, a non-practicing Jew, had grown up in a very observant Orthodox Jewish household. At Religion and Ethics, Bob and I both had contracts. Bob said he had to be consulted on all significant decisions, including the commissioning and content of all segments on the program. Mine said I had to consult Bob on all of that, but I had final decision-making authority. We both adhered to those terms, and almost never in all the years we worked together had a disagreement. Bob taught me a great deal. He had excellent editorial judgment and was a gifted writer and editor. Moreover, as many of you here experienced, he was always kind and supportive in his comments and suggestions, not a common virtue in our industry. When going over a segment with a reporter or producer, invariably he would start with a compliment, what he thought was good, well written or done, before suggesting how it could be made better if that was how he felt. In the 17 plus years we worked together, I don't recall ever seeing him say anything mean, lose his temper, or embarrass anyone. And his comments and suggestions invariably improved the program and the individual segments. Bob was a good friend and a rare and wonderful colleague to me and many of the others here today. Knowing and working with him was a great gift. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnie. And now we will hear from Lee Roll, a member of our congregation and good friend of Bob's.
Thank you. These remarks today reflect the stories and memories from our church family as we remember Bob, his leadership, music, his spirituality, and his humanity. We all share our gratitude for the many contributions that Bob made to Cleveland Park Church and our family. He loved this church home in Washington, and he worshiped here regularly when he was in town. Bob's gentle, kind spirit shines throughout, articulate, wise, and clearly compassionate and kind. We are grateful for his years of dedication and commitment to our church. His unwavering support, wise counsel, and deeply faithful leadership served as a voice of reason and a mind of thinking for the future while grappling with the realities of the present in our church. At a meeting decades ago, where the church was considering closing its doors, Bob stood up and proclaimed his faith in the people of Cleveland Park Church and his support for the church. The members decided to remain open, and we continue to thrive to this day with huge thanks to Bob. He loved his time in the choir. I actually have a picture in the parlor, which you can see afterwards, of Bob singing in the choir. His amazing and beautiful deep voice enhanced any musical piece we sang. His gracious spirit added to the closeness and congeniality of the group. One of his favorite songs was "How Can I Keep from Singing?" Bob truly embodied spirituality, combining his news background and curiosity with his love and abiding faith to discover different people's faith perspectives. Church friends recall his joining the Spiritual Formation Group. While Bob was nationally recognized as a leading scholar on Christian theology and spiritual issues, he came to the group as a fellow student, exploring with us how to interpret what we had read. We all treasure his deep humility and the respect he showed to others. There was never a better conversationalist or raconteur at coffee hour. Bob always had a group around him, and much of the time, he was just listening. He was a great world-class listener. He understood the importance of listening. It is vital for us to learn and understand. It lifts us up, and it deepens our connections. It was Bob, with his usual wisdom and calm demeanor, who listened carefully to the many voices and always brought thoughtful and meaningful contributions. One can only imagine the deliberate and substantive conversations he's now having with those who have gone before, all in the radiant eternal presence of Christ. Other church friends remembered Bob with so many extraordinary qualities: leadership with humility, deep knowledge of a wide range of issues, eloquence, charm, and yes, humor and deep faith in spirituality. Bob was the bowl of porridge that was just right, never too excited or too demure, always open, friendly, and patient. We love the times where we might catch Bob twice in a week, once live at church and then again on his Religion and Ethics News Weekly show. One of our former pastors, Dick Dodds, shared the following memories of Bob. A letter from him. Dear Cleveland Park UCC friends, it is a joy and privilege to be able to remember and honor Bob Abernethy today, a dear friend and even a pastor to me. Actually, I think our friendship, in our friendship, we truly pastored each other, even though I was listed as his pastor of record. We are all sharing many special memories of Bob today, but I wonder if I could just add a few special things about Bob from our past. It did not take anyone long to love and respect Bob and the respect that he had for Cleveland Park UCC and its members in those pioneering days of rebuilding and building an even stronger church, a village church in the heart of the city. In his inscription in the flyleaf of our copy of his book, he specifically recalls, quote, fond memories of good times and good work at Cleveland Park Church. And almost immediately, you felt his deep love for Jane and Elizabeth, these dear children always, and of Marie, who brought new life and love to him in their marriage. And Elizabeth, this is from Dick Dodds, I can assure you that you were well baptized, both in the Russian Orthodoxy liturgy and in the service of dedication in our United Church of Christ. Bob was so excited and proud, I think he could have continued with half a dozen more services. During these years, 1985 to 1993, we met often and quietly, chats that were deeply valued. One way or another, we would call each other and decide where to eat. Food was important and celebrated. These lunches were precious, no stopwatches clicking. In the relative quiet, everything could be put on the table and pastoral confidence assured. As we moved into 1992 and 93, Bob found he was wanting to reach the viewing world with more depth given to the religious issues of the day. He wanted news that was not afraid to deal with religion and life in all its complex demands. How to do this? How to find the subjects and choose the people that would be most helpful. It was always a bonus if we were in a restaurant that had paper luncheon placemats to scribble notes on. It was wonderful to see and to feel Bob come alive and begin to see how this next part of his professional life might be developed. And out of his creative mind and heart came Religion and Ethics News Weekly. In this letter from Dick Dodds, he mentions a book. So before closing these remarks, I must mention a book that rests in our church library. It's a collection of essays and reflections on faith by Bob and William Bowl and the contributors to PBS's Religion and Ethics News Weekly. But here at our church, we call it Bob's book. And he truly, deeply, and authentically lived the title, The Life of Meaning.
Thank you so much, Lee. And I believe David Abernethy is going to share with us now.
I'm a first cousin of Bob's, a decade younger than he. I want to share a few memories from different parts of his life. My earliest memory of him comes from the property in New Hampshire, where our paternal grandparents, William and Jane Abernethy, built a lakeside cottage in the early 1930s, which they and their descendants called Deepwood. I was a young boy standing on shore in the summer, looking out at the lake and watching Bob in his beloved sailboat. It was a small, nimble craft, and he spent hours in it. He knew how to tack to catch every whiff of wind and propel the boat forward. Bob loved Deepwood. Look at the picture from your service. There he was. And he had an especially close relationship with the grandparents who built the place. They had, as Pastor Ellen mentioned, taken him and his mother, Lois, into their home here in DC. After Bob's father, Robert, died tragically at age 29 from an appendicitis attack not attended to in time. The son had but the dimmest memories of his father, but intense and long-standing memories of his grandfather, whom he called Hi Daddy. That name stuck. For me and for my siblings and our cousins, our grandfather was always and only known as Hi Daddy. But back to that first memory of Bob in his boat. On reflection, I think sailing solo captures much in my cousin's life. He was an only child, raised in the absence of his real father. Without any precedent from family members to guide him, he chose his life work, reporting on national and world events over radio and TV, and interviewing other people in depth. Now, interviewing is obviously not a solo enterprise, yet it is in the sense that the interviewer selects the person to be queried, chooses the questions, and guides the conversation. Bob mastered his craft. His interviews reflected an intense interest in and empathy toward other people. He had a remarkable ability to put them at ease, to get them talking about themselves and what was important to them. Still, he managed through it all to remain an intensely private person, adept at not showing his own hand. I would have liked more reciprocity in our interactions, feeling at times that our conversations edged toward one-way interviews. But protection of personal privacy was an integral part of Bob's personality. There he was. As the saying goes, he kept his own counsel. A much later memory, when Bob was probably in his 70s, is of the most serious talk we ever had. I'd flown from my home in California for a few days in DC. Bob was well into his second reportorial career with Religion and Ethics Newsweekly, that remarkable program, as Arnie mentioned, which he initiated and which he led for 2 decades, during years when most people would have retired comfortably into retirement. Bob and I had breakfast at a nice restaurant, and not by accident, the two of us talked religion. I had grown up in a mainline Protestant family. My dad, like our shared grandfather, was a Protestant minister, and I was still attending church. But I'd begun seriously to question the central Christian claim that God, as the creator of the universe, knew each and every human being and loved us so much that God sent Jesus to this little earth as the incarnated deity. I was well on my way out the door, ready to leave behind not just Christianity, but all forms of religion. I shared my doubts with Bob and focused on the abject failure of my prayer life. I tried numerous times to get in some kind of contact with God, always without success. I told Bob the phone lines must be down, or maybe there wasn't anyone on the other end of the line to pick up when I called. Bob listened thoughtfully, as he always did, and then he asked, as if out of the blue, "What matters passionately to you?" Without hesitation, I answered, "Great music." I had particularly in mind the organ works of J.S. Bach, whose combination of mathematical rigor and beauty is simply astounding, and for me, points the way to how the universe functions. Then said Bob, "Great music is your prayer." This was an aha moment for me. "Do you mean great music counts as prayer?" I asked in surprise and relief. And Bob nodded. So what had my cousin just done? He'd helped me redefine prayer, not as communication with a real or imagined cosmic being, but as a deeper, fuller appreciation of the universe. Bach's organ music counted for me because it was my most powerful stimulus to amazement at features of the cosmos the human mind could understand, and at features we human beings could barely imagine. A final memory, Bob as master of ceremonies. Several years ago, he suggested a reunion at our family home in Deepwood of his paternal grandparents' descendants and their spouses and significant others. It took place in 2014 with about 40 people in attendance. At a festive dinner in the nearby Deering Town Hall, Bob, reveling in his dual role as pater familias and as MC, gave a moving tribute to his grandparents. What lives did they lead? What was their relationship with each other? What were their key beliefs and values? How are these put to work in the world? What is their legacy to us? If any loose pins in the room happened to drop while the MC was speaking, you would have heard them. Cousin Bob, solo sailor, compassionate and creative listener, eloquent speaker, reminding our extended family of our cultural roots. Thank you for these memories and for your long life well lived.
Thank you, David. Liz Abernethy.
Bob was 58 years old when I was born. 58. That is 3 years past the age when one is generally expected by society to join the American Association of Retired Persons. Truly, it's the last time when one has an expectation from society to do something at a specific age. 18, buy cigarettes. 21, take a drink of alcohol. 25, rent a car. 55, join AARP. And if you're Bob Abernethy, find yourself with a sudden second daughter at 58. We once had a conversation about presidents, and he told me that Calvin Coolidge had been president the year he was born. And that conversation happened during the Obama administration. Some things happened between Coolidge and Obama. And Bob covered a lot of it. I wasn't around for his stint covering Lyndon Johnson's campaign, or his report on the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the Beatles arriving in America. He told me that his colleague at the time had, having only ever read and never heard the name before, mispronounced the band name as the Beatles. Or even his Meet the Press interview with the young Michael Jackson, which you can still watch on YouTube, though I would recommend staying away from the comments section. I did, however, get a front row seat to his exciting, perhaps even ever so slightly James Bob-esque years as a foreign correspondent. In 1989, when I was 4, NBC offered him a job in their Moscow bureau, and my earliest memories of him were in our apartment on Kutuzovsky Prospect in Moscow, coming home in his trench coat, hat, and Billingham bag after another day covering the collapse of the Soviet Union. He insisted that we have reading time together before bed, no matter the circumstances or stress of the day. I usually asked for another Nancy Drew, but he snuck a few classics in there. Swiss Family Robinson, The Secret Garden, Matilda, Little Women until, spoiler alert, Beth died, and I told him we couldn't continue because if a character in the book died, that meant I had a higher chance of dying, and this is, of course, first grader logic. When he covered what was at the time euphemistically referred to as the October events of 1993, it was, a small coup, a couple of tanks, one big fire in the Duma. My mom put pillows in the windows to avoid any stray bullets coming in and hitting one of us, which is something she learned to do as a child from her mother during the Nazi occupation of Athens. That feeling of a dangerous day passing with a father out in the fracas, in the fray, incommunicado by today's hyper-connected standards, uncertain of if he'd come home safe, is one that has stayed with me for many years and not one that I'm anxious to repeat. When he covered the massacre of students in Tiananmen Square, a report for which he won an Emmy, I came with him to China, a reporter and his little sidekick. Don't worry, Mom was there too, and we stayed far away from the violence. As I recall, we went shopping for souvenirs and toys on the other side of town. My favorite memory of that time in Russia was our weekend tradition, which consisted of driving to the American embassy so he could give me swimming lessons in their indoor pool, and then picking up a VHS from the embassy video rental spot, and then stopping at the newly opened Moscow Baskin Robbins for ice cream. Vanilla for him and bubblegum for me. In the car on the way home, I'd pepper him with questions like, why don't you run for president? And why is saying, oh geez, too close to taking the Lord's name in vain for you? Then we returned to Washington, and his lifelong passion project, Religion and Ethics Newsweekly, took up much of his attention. But I fondly recall visiting the offices on H Street and spending unsupervised hours doodling on every blank whiteboard and notepad, including their makeshift cardboard audio recording booth. A running office joke that he brought home to my delight and amusement was the RENW tradition of reporting on the birthday of the Bob, that is B-A-B, not B-O-B, AKA the central figure of Bobism, precursor to the Baha'i faith. I'd ask him how the Bob was doing today, and meaning that meant, of course, how are you doing, Dad? And that is a question I can no longer ask him, at least not face-to-face or on the phone. But in the months since he left us, I find that I find him and feel him in unexpected places, be it a sliver of afternoon or even golden hour light through the curtains on the wall in my apartment. Brings to mind a study that he called me, it brings to mind a time he called me into his study to look at the beauty of the light reflecting through one of his desk prisms. He loved prisms. When I look up at the night sky on my roof in LA, he's there with me, teaching me to see the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper and Orion's Belt, exactly the same way he did on night walks in New Hampshire when I was a kid. I remember him telling me how deeply affected he was in the 60s, seeing the first photographs of Earth taken from space. And of course, when an item on a restaurant menu has either blue cheese or sherry in it as a featured ingredient, rest assured we're dining with Bob that day. And he's there in what I do professionally as well, since I followed him into a career in television. I suppose 2 generations now makes it the family business. And though I could bore you with details about how Bob is with me when I edit content for brevity or calculate time code, he asked me the time once, I told him to the second. He replied that after a career in broadcast, he appreciated a woman who could tell time with such precision, which is a comment that we could unpack for days. So let's move on. Let me instead leave you with this. In the extremely painful days after his death, I spent many hours online looking for old press photos of Bob, clips of him hosting and reporting, bits and pieces of his life from before I was even an idea, let alone a flesh and blood individual. And to my horror, I discovered that one of his career highlights, though he was either too modest or too suspect of graven images to place much value in an Emmy statuette, indeed, from about 1996 to 1998, it served as the garden feature in the front lawn of my Barbie dream house. Anyway, to my horror, I discovered that almost no record of the events of Tiananmen Square or Bob's coverage of the event exist online. It was a massive international news story. It defined the later part of his career, and it was gone, wiped from the internet. It's governments covering up past malfeasances and tech titans doing favors for leaders, and that's how we get to censorship, which is something I think he would have hated quite a bit. So when we remember Bob, let us also remember that in the words of George Orwell, journalism is printing what someone else does not want printed. Everything else is public relations. And let us remember the things that some individuals and entities would rather erase forever. Let us honor the memory of my father by refusing to conveniently forget. So thank you very much to everyone here today for remembering my father, who I loved so very much. And along with that, thank you for refusing to conveniently forget. I believe that that would, as Bob used to say, please him pink. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Liz. Jane Abernethy.
Liz, that was wonderful. And it is wonderful to be here with you all. And to know that those who could not actually join us are with us in spirit and on Zoom. Thank you, Pastor Ellen, Harold, Janice, Arnie, Lee, David, and Liz. Dad's story would be incomplete without all of us. Many of the stories that I feel compelled to share with you today have already been touched on by the 4 previous speakers. Always a risk going last. In 1931, a year after Dad's father died, his grandmother, his father's mother, to honor the son she lost, published a slim volume entitled Stories of the Christ for Little Children. She had told these stories nightly to her grandchild, Bobby Gordon, when he lived in her family home for a year while his mother was recovering from tuberculosis. The dedication reads, "To the memory of my son, who was its inspiration, and whose last words concerning his little boy were, 'Help him to make life's meaning a little clearer for others, and life itself happier.'" They didn't expect much, did they? I'll try to say how we met that challenge. Dad could make us happy with mischief. My first year of college, he took my roommate and me to dinner in New York City at Sardi's. As we left the restaurant, he saw that a nearby theater had opened its doors for intermission. Dad announced that we would second act the show. Barely understanding him, Susan and I scurried after him as he strode confidently into the theater, mingling with the paying customers. He found 3 empty seats in the orchestra on the aisle. Anxiously, I waited, expecting someone to eject us. No one did. Both Susan and I were so shocked that neither of us is sure today which show we saw. This stunt seemed way out of character for Dad, but he knew the rules, all the rules, and he knew when and how he could break them. He worked happily. He made writing and reporting look effortless. When we lived across the street from here, right across the street at 3407, Dad wrote a book called Introduction to Tomorrow, a history of the United States and the wider world from 1945 to 1965. It resulted from a program he hosted from 1961 to 63 called Update, then network television's only news program designed for students. Cousin Sarah Abernethy Snyder assisted him with research. He spent forever holed up in his office, making his manual typewriter sound like a machine gun. I admit I was jealous of that book. Work was a calling. When work called, Dad packed his briefcase and answered. In 1964 or 5, he traveled more than half the year. My mom had worked as a TV producer before they married. She never questioned the obligation. The very nature of his work made him happy. As you've heard from Arnie and David, Dad loved learning about people. He understood his privilege and his work's importance as he told stories, broadcast the news, and gave speeches. A friend noted that Dad wore his fame lightly. He rarely wanted to talk about himself, and if he did, it was because he wanted to tell you about a story he was working on and the people he was interviewing. He was interested in what we were doing, in hearing about what we found interesting. Despite his fame, he stayed grounded. Working at NBC in Burbank meant meeting celebrities coming to Johnny Carson's Tonight Show or Laugh-In, or even interviewing them. He met everyone. Before he came to Washington to be the Washington interviewer for the Today Show in 1977, he had done live 7-minute interviews 5 nights a week in Los Angeles for half a decade. 1,300 people probably in the 70s alone. I would love to have a list of everyone he interviewed in his 60-year career. Despite his skills, he could miss a trick and admit it. He told a story about a time he thought he had landed a huge story. A NASA PR guy let slip the names of the astronauts selected for the next Gemini mission. Years later, Dad realized that he hadn't really scooped anyone, but rather the names had been gently placed with him. People made him happy. A dedicated idealist, he saw the good in people and relationships. Never cynical, he took situations at face value and fully believed they would work out. When we lived in Pacific Palisades in California, Dad harnessed his idealism and dove into community improvement. By the late 1960s, Dad had enough cachet to succeed Mission Impossible's Peter Graves as the town's honorary mayor. People seemed amused that he took his figurehead appointment seriously. He established the Palisades Community Council. He worked to unify various factions of the town, and he spearheaded an effort to convert a gas station in the center of town to a small park. Named the Village Green, it flourishes even today. Never remotely materialistic, he held on to objects that he thought worked. His Billingham bag, carried by reporters still, for instance. Wow, did that thing take a beating? He used it daily for at least 30 years. In the end, it was grimy and frayed, and he would not consider replacing it. I tried. In fact, I found it nigh on impossible to buy gifts for him. He never wanted or needed anything. One year, though, Liz gave him a brown felt, maybe cowboy hat. He wore it with pride and panache for years. Even Tom Brokaw said it in a note this week that Dad never succumbed to fashion. Brokaw admitted his own journey into fashion disasters, wide collars, bell bottoms, garish ties, and wrote, "Bob stuck to Brooks Brothers, tried and true. Guess which one of us did not have to burn his suits later?" Dad liked outings for birthdays and celebrations, and going to musicals was a highlight. He loved the old classics and American popular song. He told about listening to the radio on the porch at Deepwood, his teenage ear pressed to the speaker, keeping the volume low so he wouldn't disturb the sleeping adults, listening to the hits. He loved the music of that era and made every effort to play it himself. That impetus never left him. Until the pandemic shut them down, Dad took piano lessons and loved them. They made him happy. Dad loved to sing good songs, often the 30s and 40s repertoire of the a cappella groups he sang with in college and later. Over the last 4 decades at evening's end, Dad would say, "Let's have a song." And we would launch into one of our repertoire, the highlight of which was the Donald O'Connor Ethel Merman duet from Call Me Madam, I Hear Music and You Don't Need Analyzing. In the 1960s, I'd learned my entrance driving between DC and New Hampshire, thanks to Dad banging the meter on the dashboard. You don't need. Dad's short-term memory, though, failed him. His frames of reference narrowed. In his last years, he most often asked about Mary and Liz and wanted to be sure they were well and happy and secure. His thoughts gravitated to New Hampshire and the summers he spent with family on Deering Lake. He adored the Abernethy family reunion that David and Susan hosted at Deepwood in 2014, the last time many of us were together, and where the photograph on the front of today's bulletin was taken. When the pandemic struck, his assisted living community made FaceTime appointments with family. For weeks, we FaceTimed 15 minutes, 5 days a week. You remember the beginning of the pandemic. Pretty soon there was no news to discuss, and our conversations got a little boring. Also, until I learned some basic lighting skills, Dad would complain about the shadows, the angle of the camera, my phone, the audio, as if he were producing a remote. Dad asked me if we had made the feed. I had to tell him that until our material improved, our conversations weren't going anywhere. He seemed okay with that. Once Dad had been vaccinated in March 2021, we took short excursions, and he came over to my house for the first time in about a year. As he surveyed my living room, he asked, "May I play your piano?" I said, "Of course." I gave him a glass of wine, and he walked over to the piano, sat down, and in March, played Joy to the World. Joy indeed. Dad would have loved to be here with all of you. He loved good preaching, the ritual and community of church, talking to thoughtful people, hearing terrific music, being with family, and having a glass of wine and some cheese. He did love a party. Did he fulfill his own father's wishes for him? I think so. He certainly made life's meaning a little clearer for a great many. And there is no doubt he brought joy to all of us here.
Thank you, Jane, and all of you who gave remembrances. I ask you, is it any coincidence that Bob's 2 daughters, Jane and Liz, got all the laughs? I think not. Bob was a light, and to symbolize that, our candles are going on at the end of the service, and they're not going out. And so before we sing our closing hymn, for which you are welcome to rise as you are able, I ask you to join me in prayer. Loving and gracious God, thank you for bringing us together this day to celebrate the life of Robert Gordon Abernethy. He was a good man, a true light, and I pray that wherever he is now, that light is shining forth. And I believe it is because I feel it. We were blessed to have known him. May he now rest and play and report in eternal joy and peace. And may your blessing be upon him and all here present. In your name, amen. The words to your closing hymn are on an insert in the worship bulletin. Please rise as you are able for Unto the Hills. Please be seated. After the benediction and the postlude, you are all invited into the parlor for a reception where again you may share your stories and your thoughts and your memories of Bob, along with some good food and wine. And now may God bless you and keep you. May God's presence radiate upon you and be gracious unto you. And may God be with you and grant you peace. Amen.
Peace be with you.